morning. Today we're going to talk about partial recovery, what it looks like, what to look out for, those kinds of things. And looking at Staying Sober by Gorski and Miller, we're going to use the text for a lot of the information. So to understand the nature of partial recovery, we have to understand that recovery is not a linear process. There are ups and downs, setbacks, failures, problems along the way. There are stages to recovery. And we've talked about the different stages of recovery. So let's hear what Gorski and Miller have to say about what happens when we go through those stages in their book. They say recovery from addictive disease is not a process of straight line growth. Most people recover in stages over time. They develop a new understanding of their disease and recovery. They spend time applying and integrating that new knowledge into their daily lives. Then they become comfortable and coast for a while before the need for new knowledge develops. It is common for recovering people to temporarily backslide in their recovery. This often happens when they're attempting to put new knowledge to work. The stress of change temporarily gets the best of them, and they back off for a while. As the stress goes down, they talk about how to better manage the situation. They roll up their sleeves and they get started again. Many recovering people eventually achieve long-term and comfortable sobriety. Good news. So recovery doesn't look like a straight line going up. Recovery, we get up and we're really happy that we're not using drugs and alcohol. And then we hit some stress and things get kind of worse, and maybe we start doing some old behaviors. Not necessarily using drugs and alcohol again, but thinking in the old way, what a lot of folks call stinking thinking. And then we apply what we've learned in our program, and things get better for a while. And then at this point, we may just kind of coast along, we may be okay for a little bit. And then we realize, I don't really want to coast, I want to get better. And so we apply some knowledge and we start going up again. And then something really stressful happens and we find ourselves back in that old thinking. Things get worse for a little bit. You see the pattern that I'm talking about. And this is the way recovery is for a lot of people in recovery. And it's okay, because these times where we're backsliding a little bit, those, as long as we recognize what's happening there, then those are an opportunity for growth. We can learn new and different ways for using the tools that we've picked up in our recovery program to then get back to the point where we're starting to see that line going up again. However, as Gorski and Miller go on to say, many recovering people do not make it all the way through the recovery process. Partial recovery begins when they confront a recovery task they believe to be unmanageable or insurmountable. This insurmountable recovery task is called a stuck point. Being stuck causes them to fail to complete all recovery tasks. The consequence is that they remain uncomfortable and experience a low quality sobriety. So they go on to argue that there's two ways for people to handle stuck points when they get to there. The first and desirable way is to recognize there is an issue and tackle it head on. Here's what they say about that. A healthy and productive response to hitting a stuck point is to temporarily back off in order to lower stress. The next step is to rationally examine the stuck point by discussing it with other people, and then to seek appropriate help in coping with it. Now, when they say temporarily back off, they don't mean temporarily back off your recovery program by any means. What they mean is take a breather from whatever that stressful situation is. Now, I'll give you an example. Earlier this week, I was in a very stressful situation. My wife and I were both very stressed out by things going on at work, at home, just in general. It was a very stressful time, and we were finding ourselves kind of sniping at each other and things like that. And at one point, my wife, in all her wisdom, said, let's back off a little bit. Let's not tackle some of these things right now. We've had some stress going on in life that neither of us can control. Let's just get back into kind of a normal swing of things, and then we can address some of these things that have been coming So that's a way of backing off the stress a little bit and not getting into a cycle where the stress is feeding the stress. And that's where you start to get in trouble. And that's what they talk about coming up here. So others get stuck in partial recovery by getting caught up in a cycle of denial. And this is where I found myself before my wife stepped in. I could see myself going in that direction, and instead of using my recovery tools to deal with some very stressful situations, I went back to my addictive thinking and started blaming other people around me and trying to control the world around me. And this led down a road of self-doubt and self-pity, which further increased my stress. And according to Gorski and Miller, that further increases the likelihood of staying stuck because our old friend post-acute withdrawal comes back into play. So let's hear what they say about this. Instead of taking these productive steps, many people who are stuck in recovery use denial to cope with the stuck point. The denial is not used consciously. They automatically block the awareness that something is wrong. The stuck point produces stress. The denial, while temporarily blocking the awareness of the stress, eventually intensifies it. So there's the stress feeds that stress. As the stress increases, post-acute withdrawal symptoms begin to develop and get worse. This means people develop difficulty in thinking clearly, managing feelings and emotions, remembering things, and recognizing and managing stress. The original stuck point is often overshadowed by severe problems that result from mismanaging the post-acute withdrawal. A person becomes preoccupied with these problems and fails to identify the primary cause of what is happening. He or she becomes progressively more stressed. This is the road I was on. I was starting to get some of those pause symptoms coming back because of the amount of stress I was under. I was using denial in order to deal with those, and that in turn was creating more stress, which made the pause worse, which made the denial worse, and created this cycle that, had I not broken, would have just continued. And I'm not saying I would have relapsed to alcohol and drugs, but what they talk about is that that's the danger, that if you don't arrest this kind of cycle, that's where you might end up. So they go on to say he or she becomes progressively more stressed. The increased stress leads to a state of free-floating anxiety and compulsion. The person feels compelled to do something, anything, to relieve the anxiety and compulsion, often adopting compulsive behaviors that temporarily relieve the stress. The compulsive behavior, however, produces additional long-term problems in exchange for the short-term relief. Eventually, this stress leads to an activation of the relapse process. Recovering people can become locked into a pattern of partial recovery. They progress repeatedly to the same point where they again unknowingly begin the relapse process. And finally, they say they return once again to the first stage of recovery where they're comfortable. They pursue an active recovery program until they again encounter a stage where they perceive as too frightening to face, and the cycle of partial recovery continues. This may repeat the same pattern over and over. The big book of AA calls this half measures. So the idea is that in partial recovery, we get to a point where we're doing good in recovery, life is going good, and so it seems like the things that we're doing in our program are making sense and everything's working out well, and then we encounter a stressful point. We get caught in this partial recovery cycle, and eventually the pain becomes too great. And if we don't end up relapsing at that point, we go back and kind of go to an earlier part of the recovery process and not start over again, but we go back to what we're comfortable with. And then the cycle continues. If we don't progress through the stages of recovery that I talked about in the last few videos, then this is a cycle that people can get caught in for years. And so I really like this. It puts in perspective what that partial recovery looks like, why it's important to recognize it when it happens. But it also raises some questions about what is relapse? What does it mean to relapse? What are we talking about when we talk about a relapse? And it's not necessarily just related to the use of drugs and alcohol. So next up, we're going to tackle the chapter in this book on relapse myths, things to think about there, and what relapse really means, and what it's going to take to truly prevent relapse in all of its various forms. Looking forward to going over that. In the meantime, hope you all have a great day.